Now, folks, let me tell you something. Life ain't just about what fills your belly. It's about what fills your soul. We live in a world where not every bite you take is just food. Some of it's been twisted, manipulated, even spiritualized in ways that Jesus himself warned us about. So tonight, we're not just talking about diet, no sir. We're talking about discernment. We're talking about the difference between what gives life and what steals it. Let's walk through this together, and by the end, you'll know the 3 foods Jesus said you best leave behind if you want to stay free. You ever notice how the very first story we get about humanity and God, it begins in a garden with food? That's not an accident. Out of all the ways the Creator could have framed the first test of mankind, He didn't choose war. He didn't choose money. He didn't choose politics. He chose a piece of fruit. That tells me something right there. Food's never been just food. It's always been spiritual. It's always been a test, a doorway, a connection between heaven and earth, between the body and the soul. Now think about it. When you sit down at a table, you're not just feeding your body. You're participating in something much bigger. You're saying yes to where that food came from, to the energy it carries, to the story behind it. Some meals have been blessed by the hands that prepared them, prayed over, given in gratitude. Others, well, they've been twisted, offered to idols, wrapped up in deceit. One meal brings peace, another one stirs up confusion. And if you've lived long enough, you know I'm not just talking calories and carbs. I'm talking about what happens inside your spirit. Jesus knew this. He lived in a world where meals weren't neutral. When he broke bread, it was communion, it was fellowship, it was divine connection. When he warned about certain foods, he wasn't talking about taste buds. He was talking about gateways. Because food's got that kind of power. It can connect you to God, or it can tie you to darkness. Look back at the Old Testament. The Israelites weren't just told what to eat for health reasons. Those food laws were spiritual boundaries. They separated God's people from the nations around them. Nations who sacrificed their animals to idols, who mixed blood into their rituals, who treated a feast as worship to false gods. The food wasn't just physical fuel. It was part of their worship system. And God was making it crystal clear. Don't eat what ties you to idols. Don't eat what binds you to their darkness. That wasn't about being picky. It was about being pure. Now, fast forward to Jesus. He comes on the scene and people ask him about food all the time. They wanted to trap him, test him, corner him. They thought he was about rules and regulations. But he kept pointing to the heart. He said, it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out. And a lot of folks stop right there and say, see, it doesn't matter what I eat. But hold on, that wasn't permission to consume anything without discernment. That was a reminder that the heart leads the body. That was Jesus saying, if your heart is tied to idols, then your food becomes part of that defilement. If your heart is tied to God, then your food becomes part of your offering. It's the posture of the soul that makes the plate holy or unholy. So here we are today living in a world where food is still being manipulated, marketed, and yes, even demonized. And if you don't have eyes to see it, you'll think it's just dinner. But if you look deeper, you'll realize the same truth Adam and Eve learned the hard way. Food can be a test. Food can be a teacher. Food can be a trap. That's why we've got to stop pretending our meals are neutral. They're not. They shape us, they influence us, they bind us closer to light, or they drag us toward darkness. It was true in Eden, it was true in Israel, and it was true when Jesus walked this earth, and it's still true today. Because food has always been spiritual. Now, let's talk about this simple truth. Not all food is created equal. You know it. I know it. Just because something looks good, just because it smells good, just because the package says it's all natural or organic, doesn't mean it carries goodness with it. See, we live in a world where appearances fool us all the time. We've been trained to judge by the surface, by the shine, by the sugar coating, but Jesus never judged that way. He looked deeper. He knew that some things that look harmless on the outside are carrying something poisonous on the inside. Think back to that moment in the desert when the enemy tempted him. Bread, simple bread. The devil said, turn these stones into bread. On the surface, what's wrong with bread? Jesus was hungry, fasting for 40 days, but he refused. Why? Because it wasn't about bread. It was about the source. If he had taken it, he wouldn't have just been feeding his body. He would have been agreeing with the enemy's terms. That tells us something powerful. Food is never just about what's on the plate. It's about the spirit tied to it. And that's why not all food is created equal. Some food is just food, but some food's been touched by deception. In Jesus' day, it was meat sacrificed to idols. You'd walk into a market, see meat hanging there, and unless you asked, you might not know it was used in a ritual the night before. If you ate it blindly, you were taking part in more than dinner. You were joining a worship service you didn't even know about. Jesus and later his apostles warned about that for a reason. It's not superstition, it's spiritual reality. Now you might say, well, we don't live in that world anymore. Oh, but we do. It's just dressed up differently. See, the enemy's clever. He'll wrap destruction in convenience. He'll wrap idolatry in trendiness. He'll market death as health. And before you know it, folks are consuming things that weigh down their spirit, fog up their minds, and weaken their ability to stand in truth. It might not look like idol worship, but when your body and your mind are enslaved to what you eat, you're bowing to something. Jesus pointed us to this over and over again. He called himself the bread of life. He gave us the cup as his blood. He redefined food in a way that carried eternal meaning. Why? Because he was showing us that meals are sacred. And if meals are sacred, then it only makes sense that some meals are profane. He wouldn't call himself bread and wine if food was just about nutrition. He was saying food carries meaning. Some will give life, and some will lead you away from it. And so here we are, surrounded by choices every single day. And the temptation is to think all those choices are equal, but you and I both know they're not. Some foods will strengthen your walk with God, give you clarity, sharpen your spirit. Others will dull you, distract you, tie you to systems that are anything but holy. The challenge is to open our eyes and stop being fooled by the surface. Because the truth is simple, not all food is created equal. The enemy never comes kicking down the door, announcing himself with a trumpet blast. No, he's sly. He's subtle. He's patient. He slips in through cracks you didn't even know were there. And one of the easiest ways he does that, through what you consume. See, the serpent didn't hand Eve a sword or a spear. He handed her fruit. Something simple, something ordinary, something she'd seen 1,000 times. But it wasn't just about the fruit. It was about the influence behind it, the whisper tied to it, the seed of rebellion wrapped inside that bite. That's how the enemy works. He uses what looks harmless to open the door to what's deadly. Now let me tell you, most of the time, it's not the big obvious dangers that get us. It's the little things we don't notice. A taste here, a compromise there, and it's no big deal moment that keeps repeating until suddenly it shapes the way we think, the way we feel, the way we live. You don't end up far from God overnight. You drift there, bite by bite, choice by choice, until one day you look up and wonder how you got so far from the light. Jesus knew this. That's why he was so clear when he warned his followers about leaven. He said, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. Now, leaven, that's just yeast. Tiny, small. invisible once it's mixed in, but it spreads, it grows, it changes the whole batch. That's how the enemy works with food, with habits, with influences. He doesn't hit you with something that looks dangerous. He gives you something that looks ordinary and lets it spread until it shapes your whole spirit. And think about it. How often do we let things into our life just because they look small, safe, harmless? That snack, is tied to something dark in its source. That ritual meal you tell yourself doesn't matter. That choice you brush off is just food. Before you know it, you've opened a door, you've said yes without realizing what you agreed to. And once the door is cracked, the enemy doesn't need to ask permission anymore. He already has a foothold. That's why discernment matters. That's why Jesus told his followers to stay awake, stay watchful, stay aware. Because the battle isn't always in the obvious. It's in the subtle. It's in the small. And food, well, that's one of the oldest tricks in the book. The enemy knows you have to eat. He knows you'll reach for what's in front of you. And he's betting you won't ask the deeper questions. Where did this come from? What's tied to it? What spirit is behind it? I'll tell you what, if the enemy can slip in through something as small as a piece of fruit, don't you think he's still using the same playbook today? He doesn't need a new strategy. That old one works just fine because we still underestimate it. We still think it's just food. We still think it's just a meal. But Jesus said, be watchful. He said, stay sharp, because the enemy loves subtle entrances. And once you know that, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start paying attention. You start praying over your meals, not out of habit, but out of understanding. You start choosing carefully, not because you're scared, but because you're free. And freedom means shutting every door the enemy tries to slip through, because the enemy loves subtle entrances. When Jesus spoke, he didn't just talk about what people could see with their eyes. He had this way of peeling back the curtain, showing us what was really going on underneath. He knew there were layers. What looked ordinary on the outside was often charged with spiritual meaning on the inside. And when it came to food, he wasn't shy about pointing out that some of it carried hidden ties to things most people would rather ignore. See, in the culture he lived in, food wasn't just food. A meal wasn't just a meal. In many places, it was tied directly to worship, to sacrifices, to rituals people offered up to false gods. You'd sit down at a table, take a bite, and without realizing it, you'd be taking part in a system designed to pull hearts away from the one true God. Most folks didn't think about that. They just saw meat in the marketplace or bread passed around at a feast, but Jesus saw deeper. He saw the strings attached, the spiritual contracts hidden behind the plate. That's why he warned about it. He didn't want his followers blind to what they were stepping into. He knew the enemy's clever. He'll disguise corruption in something as innocent as a shared meal. He'll hide bondage behind the appearance of fellowship. Jesus saw that eating food offered to idols wasn't just filling your stomach, it was opening your spirit to an influence you didn't bargain for. And he wasn't about to let his people walk into that trap without sounding the alarm. The early church wrestled with this too. You read the letters from Paul and you can hear the same heartbeat. They were surrounded by cultures where feasts doubled as idol worship. And Paul echoes Jesus saying, don't do it. Don't drink from the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. He was carrying forward the very warning Jesus had lived out, that what looks like dinner can really be an invitation to darkness. Now here's the thing. This isn't about being paranoid, it's about being aware. Jesus never wanted us living in fear of every bite, but he did want us to see that what we consume matters spiritually as much as physically. He wanted us to understand that the line between worship and compromise can be as thin as what's sitting on the plate in front of us. And let's be honest, not much has changed. The names of the idols may have shifted. The rituals may look different, but the spirit behind them hasn't gone anywhere. There are still foods, still practices, still celebrations that carry a darkness most people never stop to question. And if we don't have discernment, we end up partaking without realizing the ties we're making. That's why Jesus exposed it. That's why he pulled back the veil. Because freedom doesn't come from ignorance. It comes from truth. He wanted us to walk in clarity, not confusion. To eat and drink in ways that align us with heaven, not drag us into the shadows. To see that every choice carries weight, even the ones that seem as simple as what we put on our plates. And once you see it, once you really understand what Jesus was showing us, you can't go back to thinking food is neutral, because you know better now. Because Jesus exposed the hidden tithe. When Jesus warned his followers, he didn't just leave the message vague. He pointed to specific things that needed to be avoided, because he knew how easy it is for us to blur the lines and justify what we want to justify. He knew our hearts. He knew that if he didn't spell it out, people would say, well, maybe just a little won't hurt, or surely God doesn't mind this part. So he made it plain. There were certain foods, certain practices that carried spiritual danger, and he didn't want his people tangled up in them. God taught the law of antinomian. One of those warnings was about food sacrificed to idols. Now back then that was common practice. Meat didn't just come from the butcher's block. Most of the time it came from temples where animals had been offered in worship to false gods. And once the ritual was done, the meat was sold in the marketplace. To most folks, it was just business. But Jesus knew what was really happening. He knew that eating that food wasn't just about filling your stomach. It was about partaking in the worship that animal had been tied to. And he said, don't do it. Don't share my table and the table of demons. That wasn't a suggestion. That was a line drawn in the sand. Another warning was about blood. God had been consistent on that from the beginning. Way back in the law, he told his people not to eat or drink blood because life is in the blood. Life belongs to God. And when people consumed it, they weren't just breaking a rule. They were crossing a spiritual boundary. Pagan nations drank blood in rituals, believing it gave them power. It wasn't just superstition, it was demonic. Jesus carried that same teaching forward. He gave his followers his blood in the cup, holy and pure as the covenant of life, and he made it clear that any other blood tied to any other worship had no place in his kingdom. And then there was food tied to impurity, things connected to corruption and unclean practices. Jesus didn't make these warnings to burden people. He wasn't trying to weigh them down with rules. He was trying to keep them free. He was showing them that certain foods weren't just bad for the body, they were bad for the soul. They carried influence, they carried bondage, they carried ties that could pull a person right back into the darkness he came to deliver them from. That's the heart of it. This was never about legalism. It wasn't about checking boxes or pretending holiness is found in a diet plan. No, it was about recognizing that our choices matter, that what we put into our bodies isn't separate from what happens in our spirits. Jesus wanted his people alert, discerning, awake to the reality that not everything on the table is good for you, even if it looks good. And let's be real, we face the same thing today. We might not be shopping in temples, but the enemy hasn't retired those tactics. He still disguises compromise in the form of a meal. He still uses food, trends, and culture to slip spiritual poison into our lives. That's why our 3 warnings are just as relevant now as they were then. They remind us to be mindful, to choose wisely, to separate ourselves from anything that carries ties to idolatry, to blood rituals, to corruption, to separating someone carries ties to idolatry, to blood rituals, to corruption. Because the 3 foods to avoid were never about restriction, they were about freedom. When you start aligning what's on your plate with the truth of God, something shifts. It's not just about health, though your body feels it too. It's not just about self-control, though discipline is part of it. It's about purity. It's about freedom. Jesus didn't come to bind us up with rules. He came to set us free from the chains we don't always see. And one of those chains has always been tied to what we consume. You ever notice how heavy compromise feels? You take in something you know doesn't sit right. Maybe you justify it in the moment, but later you feel it. You feel the fog, the weight, the disconnection. On the flip side, when you choose purity, when you make that decision to honor God, even in what you eat, you feel lighter, your spirit sharpens, your mind clears. It's like your whole being lines up with heaven, and suddenly you're walking in a freedom you didn't even know you were missing. That's the power of obedience in the little things. Jesus knew this. He wasn't just giving commands to test his people. He was giving wisdom to protect them. Every boundary he set was a pathway to more freedom, not less. When he said to avoid certain foods, he was saying, don't take on a burden you don't need. Don't tie yourself to darkness when I've already made you free. Purity isn't about missing out. It's about living without hidden shame. And purity opens doors. When your spirit is clear, you hear God's voice more easily. When your body isn't bogged down with things tied to corruption, your soul rises. That's when discernment gets stronger. That's when prayers feel more alive. That's when worship flows like it should, without the weight of compromise pressing down. Choosing purity is like clearing the static off a radio. You tune into the frequency of heaven, and suddenly the signal's clean. Now, some people hear this and think it's extreme, but it's really not. It's simple. It's a choice. Every meal, every table, every invitation, you get to decide whether you're going to align with God or not. And when you do, when you keep choosing Him, the freedom grows. It's like momentum. One choice builds on another, and before you know it, you're living lighter, walking straighter, hearing clearer. That's what Jesus wanted for us. That's what He still wants. And let's not forget, freedom is contagious. People notice it. They see the peace, the joy, the strength you carry, and they start to ask questions. Your life becomes a testimony without you even having to preach. You sit at a table, and the way you choose purity becomes a light for someone else who's been stuck in the dark. That's kingdom living right there. That's freedom overflowing. So here's the truth. Every choice matters, even the ones that look small. When you choose purity, you're not just saying no to corruption. You're saying yes to life. You're saying yes to clarity. Yes to peace. Yes to the kind of freedom Jesus died to give you. And the more you say yes, the more you realize this is how we were meant to live all along. Because choosing purity unlocks freedom. So here's where it all comes together. From the very beginning, food has carried more weight than we've wanted to admit. In Eden, it was the fruit. In Israel, it was the sacrifices. In Jesus' time, it was meat and drink tied to idols. And today, it may be dressed up different, but the spirit behind it hasn't changed. The table has always been a battleground. Light on one side, darkness on the other. What Jesus really showed us is that every choice has a spirit behind it. Not all food is created equal. The enemy doesn't come at you with flashing red lights. He slips in subtly, quietly, through something as ordinary as what you eat. Jesus exposed those hidden ties, pointed out the traps, and gave us the wisdom to walk in freedom. He drew the line on what to avoid, not to hold us back, but to keep us clear, to keep us whole, to keep us close to Him. And the beauty of it is this: when you choose purity, when you decide to honor Him even in what you consume, you're not stepping into legalism, you're stepping into freedom. You're not missing out, you're gaining life. You're opening your spirit to clarity, your heart to strength, your soul to joy. And the more you live this way, the lighter you walk, the brighter you shine, and the freer you become. So as you sit at the table, as you make those choices, remember, this isn't just about food. It's about your soul. It's about your walk. It's about living in the kind of freedom Jesus laid his life down to give you. Because in the end, the table you choose tells the story of the life you live.